Okay, so welcome back, everybody. This is Dr. Z. We're on World War One. This is part two. We're going to be talking about the Western Front. So, as the war begins, all right, you can see some of the battles here. Austria-Hungary, supported by Germany, used that assassination of Franz Ferdinand as an excuse to deal with what was called the, quote, Serbian question. An ultimatum was sent to Serbia, but it was rejected. Serbians, who were supported by Russia, then ordered mobilization. Austria-Hungary then declared war on Serbia because they were disappointed by the reaction from Serbia on July 28th, 1914. Now, Kaiser Wilhelm could have stopped the whole war at this point, but he didn't. And by July 31st, Russians ordered a full mobilization. And the Schlieffen Plan could not afford to allow Russians to mobilize without launching an attack. So Germany therefore declared war on Russia on August 1st, and then France 2 days later. So the Schlieffen Plan already is kind of out the window, although they still go in and invade Belgium, thus calling what are known as the Belgian atrocities. The Belgian resistance led the Germans to implement a policy of what was called frightfulness against Belgian civilians soon after their invasion, in which massacres, executions, hostage-taking, the burnings of towns and villages took place. This became known as the Belgian atrocities, or the Rape of Belgium. The babies on bayonets that you see here, right? This is British propaganda, though, in order to create a sense of rage about the war. And if you look at the faces of those German soldiers there, right, they're the British were using sort of monstrous tropes, right, to get people to think about the war. Your key concept outline talks about war propaganda, right? It stresses that the economic collapse and total war in World War I engendered internal conflicts within European states, created the conflicting conceptions of the relationship between the individual and the state. During World War I, states increased the degree and the scope of their authority over their economies, societies, and cultures, and this is what we call total war. The demands of total war required the centralization of power and the regimentation of the lives of citizens. And during the war, governments sought to control information, and they used propaganda to create stronger emotional ties to the nation and its war effort. Many nations did this. Ironically, these measures also produced a lot of distrust of traditional authorities. So where did World War I happen? I always talk about the 5 W's, right? Who, what, when, where, why. So when we think of the where of World War I, we think of the Western Front, right? Which is really the iconic thought that, especially Americans and British and French and Germans think of when they think of the war. It's a system of trenches, 475 miles of them, and different fortifications that separated an area known as no man's land. It's sort of the space between the trenches. And we'll look at how some of those trenches are designed. There's also the Eastern Front in Eastern Europe, vast Eastern plains, limited rail network. It's not trench warfare stalemate, but the scale of the conflict on the Eastern Front, although it gets a little bit less, popularity in the sense of like attention, when historians look at the war, the conflict was just as large as it was on the Western Front. There's also a Middle Eastern Front and an Italian front that saw heavy fighting. And there's also fighting at sea and for the very first time in the air. So it becomes a world war right away, right? While the majority of the conflict is in Europe, also because of Europe's colonization, right? The scramble, the new imperialism, right? We see fighting happening in Africa. We've got British, French, and German colonial forces in Africa. For example, on August 7th, French and British troops invaded the German protectorate of Togoland, and on the 10th of August, German forces in Southwest Africa attacked South Africa, right? So the Europeans are seeking to take each other's colonies, is what the motivation there is. In Eastern Europe, the Serbian army is fighting against the invading Austrians. And that begins right in the summer of 1914. In Asia, allies are trying to seize German colonies in the Pacific. So they thought, if we could take all the German colonies, we will, we'll take away some of their resources. New Zealand occupied German Samoa, okay, which was later Western Samoa, on the 30th of August. On the 11th of September, the Australian Naval and Military Expeditionary Force landed on part of German New Guinea. Japan also seized Germany's Micronesian colonies, and a German coal port on the Chinese Shandong Peninsula, which you see there in red on the right-hand side. So within a few months, the Allied forces had seized all of the German territories in the Pacific, which was a major blow to the Germans. And then the German forces are in Belgium and in France. This is called the Western Front. So Germany invades that neutral Belgium, right? And then that's in the very beginning of the war in August of 1914. But the Germans are fighting a two-front war, right, on the Western Front and the Eastern Front. So they couldn't pay as much attention to protecting their colonies. The Western Front, though, as I said, gets most of the press in World War I. After Germany invaded a neutral Belgium and then France, they took over important industrial regions in France. They also aimed to reach the coast in what was called the Race to the Sea. And after the Battle of the Marne, both sides started to dig in along a meandering line of fortified trenches stretching from the North Sea to the Swiss frontier with France. And that line was essentially unchanged for the duration of the war, right? They're trying to push and pull and take that territory of Northwest France, but the line really doesn't change at all. And you can see where, right, how far west the German advance was in that dark red line there. Right, and then the trench line after November of 1914, and that blue line there, and you can see the Allied forces, and they're pushing westward while the German forces are pushing eastward, and that continues for just about 4 years. Trenches have a particular architecture to them. This is the no man's land that I talked about, right? So you've got let's say an enemy trench here, and then this is your trench, and you're backed up with these other trenches, right? And the whole idea was to go over the top of no man's land and take your the other side's trenches. The Battle of the Marne is one of the significant battles of World War I. The AP gods do not require you to know specific battles or dates or anything like that, or who won or who lost, mainly because most of them were stalemates. So this is right in the beginning, September 6, 1914. The French attacked a gap in the German line. It's famous because in order to get a lot of the French troops to the battle, the taxis were requisitioned in Paris in order to help with that mobilization effort. The French won, but by November, an unbroken line of 400 miles of trenches were then dug in through Belgium and through northern France, and that would not change for another 4 years. Some of the architecture of the trenches included barbed wire. That would be a barrier in no man's land. It would make it very difficult to go over the top. And of course, the machine guns, as you see here with the Maxim gun used, that we explored that when we talked about new imperialism. Also, there was poison gas. So gas masks were used. The gas was heavy and it would settle into the trenches. And so people, if they experienced a gas attack, they had to put their mask on. Otherwise, it would be lethal. And tanks were used, right? Tanks could easily plow down some of that barbed wire. They could travel over trenches, and were seen as a something that was very helpful. But this is one of the first time we see these weapons used. The Battle of Verdun was in 1916. The Germans were on the offensive in this battle, but 700,000 people were killed on both sides. Right? And absolutely no ground was won. And when we think of battles like the Battle of Verdun and the stalemate of it, right, after the war, a lot of people are going to start to feel like, gosh, like what's the point of all of this, right? And then there's a second Battle of Verdun in 1917. Basically, the same thing happens. The Battle of the Somme is also a famous battle. This is in 1916. This is a British offensive. And it's known as exemplifying the horrors of trench warfare. Week-long artillery bombardments on the German line. After this, the British went over the top into no man's land. Germans fled their dugouts. Germans then mowed down the British soldiers, who ended up stuck in the barbed wire, right? So after they go over the top, they're stuck in the barbed wire, and the Germans just kill them with their machine guns anyway. So we have 420,000 British and 200,000 French soldiers are killed, and then 600,000 Germans. So it's basically the same, give or take 20,000. Right. And one historian says they were killed or wounded defending an insignificant piece of land. All right. That is the end of this. We will talk about the entry of the U.S. into the war and the Eastern Front. Okay. And also the end of the war in the next discussion. Thank you.